UAA, College of Business and Public Policy.
Hello, I'm Dr. Darren Prokop, Professor of Logistics at the College of Business and Public Policy at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Welcome to my video interview with Bill OLeary, President and CEO of Alaska Railroad, recorded on December 10, 2018. Mr. OLeary, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you achieved your position of leadership at the Alaska Railroad.
So, I'm Bill OLeary. I'm President and CEO of the railroad, and I'm actually originally from Fairbanks and been born and raised in Fairbanks, lived my whole life in Alaska, actually. Went to UAF and graduated with a degree in accounting back in the day. And then immediately headed off to work for the state legislature as an auditor, kind of the state equivalent of the GAO office. And earned a CPA license doing that. And one of the entities on my audit beat, as it was the Alaska Railroad. So I used to spend a significant period of time every year or every other year over at the railroad. So I got to know the railroad some. I moved from the audit group to actually act as the financial controller for the Alaska International Airport System, and did that for a couple of years, which was a great experience also. But the railroad position of Chief Financial Officer came open, and I moved into that role in the 2001 timeframe. So I've been at the railroad, pushing 18 years at this point. I've been the CFO for the majority of that. I was the Chief Operating Officer for a short period of time, and then, as I refer to it, ascended to the throne in a little over 5 years ago as the CEO.
And the CEO, President and CEO, is appointed by a board of directors?
Correct. We've got a 7-person board of directors that's appointed by the governor, and they hire and fire the Chief Executive Officer.
Is there a term of employment that has to be renewed by the board, or is it open-ended?
For my position, you mean? No, it's open-ended until they say differently.
What are some of the key facts and or statistics we ought to know about the Alaska Railroad?
Well, without dredging too far back into history, I will a little bit of history about the railroad and just take you up to current day on it. So the railroad itself was created by the federal government. They're taking a number of failed railroads back in the 1910 to 1915 time frame and kind of combining those together, finishing the railroad in the early 1920s, and where it remained under federal ownership until roughly 1985. When it was sold to the state of Alaska. And the state set it up as a public corporation, but a different type of corporation than many of the other state-owned entities. The primary difference is that the railroad is charged with being self-sustaining. So it has to basically earn its keep. It has to go and earns it through a number of different ways we can talk about here. But it's not subject to the state's Executive Budget Act, meaning it doesn't go to the legislature for its annual funds. It has to earn them out there. So it was set up as a public corporation, again, 7-person board of directors appointed by the governor, and it's a model that has worked, I think, very well over the years. Some of our just other things to know about the railroad: it goes from Tidewater, it's Seward, all the way up through a little bit outside of Fairbanks, towards the Air Force Base, Eielson Air Force Base up there. So give or take 600 miles of track when you count all the spur lines and yards and things like that we have around. We move, give or take, 500,000 passengers annually, and depending on the year, somewhere in the 4 to 5 million tons of freight every year. We also have significant real estate holdings. So when the state purchased the railroad from the federal government, along with the track, the equipment, everything else, came 36,000 acres of land. And about half of that is used in our operations, half of it is used or is available then for lease or other use by the private sector, other governmental entities out there. So we're what we believe to be the last full-service railroad in the country, meaning we provide both freight and passenger services.
of the land that's available for private sector tenants, how much of that land, what percentage of that land is in use right now and earning rent for you?
Sure. So there's about, again, about 18,000 acres of land, but it's distributed throughout the rail belt, all the way from Seward up to through Fairbanks. We have significant holdings in Anchorage and Fairbanks, certainly, but we also have a lot of holdings in up in the Healy area and around Hurricane Gulch area. So some of it is a little more desirable than other land. Right now, I think we've got just under 3,000 acres under lease at this point, lease or permit. So either longer-term lease or shorter-term permit activity. And the real estate is really important to us. I mean, so really, three stools to the financial table of the Alaska Railroad, and it's freight operations, it's passenger operations, and it's real estate operations.
Right. And talking about the connection of the railroad from the Port of Seward all the way up through Anchorage and up to Fairbanks, a major spur connecting to that trunk line is from the Port of Whittier. That's your connection also of the railroad to the lower 48. Could you say something about how the railroad connects to the lower 48 via the Port of Whittier?
You bet. I mean, it's actually one of the more interesting, one of the more innovative parts of the Alaska Railroad. We are connected to the lower 48 railroads through a rail barge system, actually two rail barge systems, one done in cooperation with the Canadian National Railroad, which sails out of Prince Rupert on a, give or take every 2 weeks or so basis. And then we have weekly service from the Port of Seattle, and that's in combination with our partners over at Alaska Marine Lines, a Linden company. And it's actually a rail barge, or a series of rail barges. So these barges have actual tracks on them, about 8 tracks each. So effectively what this means is we do connect to the lower 48 system. So as an example, oil companies can order an order of pipe. It can be rolled and loaded onto rail cars down in Florida, and then it'll be railed across the U.S. Through the domestic system up to Seattle, rolls directly onto our rail barge system, is brought up then to Whittier, rolls directly off of the rail barge onto our system, taken up to Fairbanks, transloaded onto truck, and then brought up to the North Slope. So it's a tremendously efficient, very economical way of moving heavy materials. So really, we think it's we know it's the longest rail haul in the country, certainly, when you factor in the barge operation.
Yes, from Prince Rupert, BC to Whittier is not a short trip at all. What is the turnaround time when the barge comes into the Port of Whittier? What is the time to load, unload, or unload and then load and then turn around and go back?
And because it's Whittier, it depends on what the weather is for the most part. But once it gets in there, our guys, and depending on how how loaded the barges can actually carry up to 50 rail cars, and also a number or a significant amount of container type traffic, also just on overhead racks. And those can be turned in certainly 24 to 36 hours and get it right back sailing southbound again.
Yes, and also the traffic from the Port of Whittier that connects to the main trunk line goes through the Whittier Tunnel, which is a very, very long tunnel. I think it's the longest in the country except for Boston's Big Dig, if I have the statistics correct. So what's it like having the traffic go through that tunnel?
Really interesting how that works. I mean, the railroad actually owns the tunnel, and for years it was the only rail was used in that tunnel. So about 1999, 2000 or so, I think they turned it into a road rail tunnel, so obviously requires a lot of coordination. Rail and road they peacefully coexist, but they don't happen at the same time. So there's intervals for rail, there's intervals for openings, tunnel openings for the road, and you've got to get obviously going both ways to provide the people access to Whittier out of there. So it works well, but it takes a lot of coordination with the State Department of Transportation, who operates the tunnel at this point through a contractor.
And this is one of the rare examples of a toll tunnel, and the toll revenue, does that go to the Alaska Railroad?
No, that actually goes to Department of Transportation and is used for some of the maintenance certainly on the tunnel, but also the operations of the tunnel control group.
Okay, so putting some of these pieces together, would you say that the Alaska Railroad is a critical piece of the Alaska economy?
being slightly biased on that, but it is. There is no doubt about that in my mind. I mean, we're in a state that is, use this term a lot, but really, just woefully lacking in just basic infrastructure. And the railroad provides a tremendous artery to move things, both freight and passengers in a very efficient manner. Rail is extraordinarily efficient in its in the space it plays in. I mean, it's not something that can compete with trucks for speed-wise, but it is something from a perspective of moving heavy or awkward, cumbersome type materials very well. So. It's a key piece of infrastructure for the state, and both from Seward to Anchorage, Anchorage to Fairbanks, the Whittier leg, all of that plays into it. I mean, we've had, just looked on the passenger side alone, we believe somewhere along the line we're taking, between 8,000 and 9,000 motor coach trips off of the road system annually with just our passenger service alone. And if anybody has had the pleasure of being behind, a series of motor coaches on the Seward Highway or the Parks Highway or the Glen Highway, that it sometimes isn't the most fun place to be. So just from the perspective of the wear and tear on the roads and just the efficiency of moving larger quantities of materials or passengers.
Let's take a look at the passenger side as well, and then we'll talk about freight. On the passenger side, I think the railroad is renowned for having some great tour guides. When you have these passengers, most of them from the outside, seeing Alaska for the first time, just wonderful stories to share when they have their PA system and they're telling about there is a moose and stopping the train. It's quite the customer service experience for these tourists. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, you bet. So passenger is really what now freight pays a lot of the bills. Real estate is absolutely key for us because it's very consistent even as the ups and downs of the business cycles go. But passenger is what we are known for. There is no doubt or question about that. We run upwards of 20 trains a day during the busy summer season of different passenger services out there. But and part of that is our tour guide program, which I'm extremely proud of, and we actually work with the local high schools and the King Career Center here in Anchorage to basically train juniors and seniors in high school, and then we hire them for the summer, and they provide commentary and really just provide a really terrific touch of Alaskana to the passengers on the railroad. And they, these are, again, 16, 17, 18-year-old students, and so they bring with it their own unique perspective of many of them have grown up in Alaska here or certainly live in Alaska now. So they provide just the passengers really, really enjoy that aspect of our passenger service.
And another piece, too, is you have a lot of passengers that get on the railroad because they've disembarked off of a cruise ship. Most of the cruise ship passengers, am I right, would be on private cars attached to the train? Is that usually the case when they come off a cruise ship?
Right, so on our passenger service, we really have two kinds of cars out there. We are coaches out there. We have the Alaska Railroad blue and gold coaches, and then we also do have what we call our pull contracts, where we pull cars owned by either primarily cruise companies, or there is a private tour company that owns 4 cars also here, and they'll ride on our tracks, being pulled by our locomotives there. So, big part of that certainly is supporting the cruise industry out there, and they fill their cars with cruise passengers. There's a number of cruise passengers who will finish the cruise, finish the land tour they want, spend a little extra time in Alaska. Maybe end up taking the Alaska Railroad in some of our coaches too. So it works very well for us with our partnership with the different cruise companies and the different tour companies.
And most of the cruise ship passengers would enter the system at the port of Seward, sometimes the port of Anchorage, is that correct?
3 different ports, really. You've got a majority of them come into the port of Seward, which, another part of our real estate holdings are we own a number of docks in the state. We own a couple docks in Whittier. We own 3 docks down in Seward, actually, a freight, a passenger, and a dock, a natural resource loading dock also then. And The majority of the cruise passengers will come into the Port of Seward on our passenger dock. There also is a privately owned dock in Whittier that we also service with our passenger service, and then when there's only I think the one ship that comes into the port of Anchorage, but we certainly offer a number of land tours that are very popular with that stop.
Changing over to freight, tell us about the type of freight that is typical for the Alaska Railroad to haul.
So we haul stuff that in some ways a lot of other folks don't want to haul, but our niche for the most part is, again, really heavy or hazardous or cumbersome type of materials, or materials that really need to be moved in great quantities. So we will move coal. We used to have two coal lines of business. Basically, the only operating coal mine is the Usabelli coal mine outside of Healy, Alaska, up there by Denali Park. And we will move coal northbound up to Fairbanks area to support the military bases, the University of Alaska up there, and also the city of Fairbanks has coal-fired generation. We used to move coal from Healy to Tidewater at Seward for export to places like Chile, Hong Kong, or not Hong Kong, but China and other areas, Korea. But that, given some of the changes in the world market out there, that service is currently suspended, isn't operating. So coal, typically for railroads, is a big deal for us. It has been, a significant portion for us. We also move petroleum products, and we used to move significant petroleum products from the refinery in the North Pole area outside of Fairbanks down to Anchorage International to feed the great beast there with jet fuel. With the closure of the refinery in Fairbanks, we actually don't move any southbound petroleum products anymore, refined petroleum products, but we do move northbound now to take product from the Port of Anchorage to move it up to the Fairbanks area, both for Fairbanks usage, but primarily for to be transloaded then onto truck and taken up to the North Slope. So petroleum is another line of business for us. We have a very significant seasonal gravel haul where we take product from the Metsu Valley and bring it into Anchorage for road work and other construction activities during the summer months. And that's one that kind of ebbs and flows with the again, the capital budgets that are available out there normally at the state and federal level. Then we have, of course, our interline service, which I talked about a little earlier, which is the barge service, and that just interline meaning connecting with other railroads out there. A big portion of the interline service is in support of the oil industry up on the North Slope. And again, we bring in pipe, we bring in chemicals, we bring in drilling muds, things of that nature on the barge, railed up to Fairbanks, and then transloaded onto truck.
And you also had a recent demonstration project whereby you were moving liquefied natural gas. Tell us a little bit about that project and how it might move into the future.
Yeah. So our LNG haul is started out as a really us wanting to be of assistance to Fairbanks area. Fairbanks, of course, with colder than the Anchorage area, and also no easy source, readily accessible source of natural gas. So they use heating oil, they burn wood up there, causes issues with air quality, causes issues just with cost, especially when the price of oil was significantly higher than it is right now. So there's been a statewide push to try to get gas to Fairbanks. And we have offered ourselves as an interim solution until a gas line is built that would provide access to natural gas for Fairbanks. So we said, look, we can move LNG, we can do it safely, we can do it in commercial quantities out there. Only issue was that no railroad in the U.S. at that point had been approved for movement of LNG, liquefied natural gas, on ISO tank containers. So we went through a relatively significant process with our regulator, the Federal Railroad Administration, to receive that approval. And we did finally received that approval, and we wanted to demonstrate that ability. So we moved, I think for 1 month, I think about 8 runs, we moved 2 tanks of natural gas between the LNG facility at outside of Port Mackenzie to up to Fairbanks. And very successful, very safe, had a number of very concerned regulators watching the entire thing, but it was a good thing. Right now, we're kind of waiting on Fairbanks and the utilities up there to necessarily sort of catch up here more than anything else, or kind of figure out exactly what their plan is. They are completing a storage tank up in Fairbanks. It's a huge 5 million gallon storage tank that will allow them to receive, again, commercial quantities of LNG. Right now, the LNG is trucked up there, and that's fine for the the quantities they're moving right now. But if they're going to expand that to a much greater audience up in Fairbanks, we think rail is a great way to do that.
And that trucking operation is starting from Port Mackenzie then? And so the intent then is to have the LNG tankers come to Port Mackenzie, switch over to your special tankers on the rail and up to Fairbanks. That's the intent. Yeah,
there's definitely different models out there. There's been different groups that are talking about building a new LNG plant, actually right alongside or very close to our main line, which would certainly make it easier. There's talk about using the old Conoco plant down in Nikiski to produce the LNG, then truck it up to either Crown Point or Portage area, where it can get on rail easily. Lots of different opportunities or options available on that.
And your special grant by the government to do this operation, is that open-ended, or has that closed off, subject to reapproval? What is the current status?
Sure, current status is it isn't open-ended. I think it's still out in the we've got a couple years, I believe, left on that, but no reason to believe that it couldn't be renewed. We keep in contact with the regulator about this, keep them up to date on what we're doing with this. Since we became the first railroad in the country to have the approval to move LNG, there have been others that have received it since. So I think the regulators are getting more and more comfortable with moving LNG by rail.
Mr. OLeary, what components go into your calculation of service charges? Do you have a tariff schedule, or are charges made on a customer-by-customer basis?
Right. So the answer is yes, both actually. We do have a general tariff schedule out there, but that said, somewhere in the 90% of our freight moves are done through contracts with different shippers. And our costing methodology, one thing that's interesting, we are owned by the state of Alaska. At the end of the day, we are a governmental entity, but again, we are charged with being self-sustaining. So that means that we compete in the marketplace out there. So, some people look at it and say, well, you're really the only freight railroad in the state. You've got a monopoly. Well, that's really not the case. We have competition in every aspect of what we do. And so the market really drives a lot of our pricing activity and our pricing decisions.
And you were mentioning about 10% of your customers will use the tariff. Is that tariff under your strict control, or is there any government oversight as you set those tariff rates?
So no strict government oversight for setting the tariffs, but certainly there is a robust appeal process should somebody disagree with those tariffs that could be taken up to a Surface Transportation Board.
Okay. Does the same go for your customer-by-customer rates as well? Should you want to negotiate a much higher increase? Can they appeal that too, or do they just take it as given?
They understand that they have other options out there, and will not afraid to remind us of that with some level of regularity.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about your reliance on government funding at the federal, state, and municipal levels.
So again, we don't go to the legislature for our annual monies, either operating or capital budgets. That power is vested at our board of directors level. So really, the only state funding that we have received in the past has been for projects, capital type activities that are really more of a statewide importance than they are necessarily immediately for the Alaska Railroad, with the exception of one federally mandated safety system where we did request some state funds because it was just an incredibly expensive project for us. So not a lot of state money happening on any kind of a regular basis out there. There's no municipal funding or anything like that for us. By virtue of the fact that we run year-round scheduled passenger service, we, like every other year-round scheduled passenger operator, are eligible for monies from the Federal Transit Administration, an arm of the U.S. Department of Transportation. So we are in a formula, these formula monies come to us based on statistics that we provide to U.S. DOT. And those monies are really critical for us to continue to be able to offer the services that we do, and for us to maintain the vast infrastructure we have in really in the condition that it's in. We've actually, for some part of those monies, we've actually leveraged those monies, issued public debt bonds to rework accelerate our track improvement program, our track rehabilitation program, and we're paying off the majority of those bonds with those federal monies.
Also, speaking of operations, the Alaska Railroad, the trains are noted for stopping to pick up passengers basically at any stop. It's almost like a bus. Could you tell us a little bit about that policy and that service?
Sure, and that's, again, one of the more uniquely Alaskan aspects of the passenger service. Try doing that with Amtrak, it won't work particularly well for you, but we do offer on many of our passenger lines a whistle stop service, or a flag stop service rather, where, again, it's just known that if you are out there and you flag the train down, the train will stop for you and you can get on. You know, in some of our service levels, we actually really go to areas that are, not accessible by road. Now, Alaskans have, many of them actually live out in some of these areas, or have, vacation properties out in those things, recreational cabins and things like that. And so the only access is through our passenger service. So again, it's not like you're going to confuse anywhere we stop out there with Grand Central Station in New York, but it's so folks can wave us down and we'll stop, and they can tell us when they think they're going to be back here, and we'll be on the lookout for them.
Are they expected to have a ticket in hand, or can they purchase it once they board?
They can purchase it once they board, and many of the regulars out there are on, I wouldn't call it necessarily a punch card, but some type of system like that. So it's a really uniquely Alaskan aspect of this thing, and again, not sure of anywhere else that runs a flag stop at the operation in the States.
Well, that takes us to the possibility of commuter rail. Is that something that the Alaska Railroad is thinking about, a pure commuter type system?
Yeah. So really, one of the things that kind of our guiding mission is, we're here as an agent of economic development for the state. I mean, that's why the state purchased the Alaska Railroad. And one of the things that we certainly see as could be helping fulfill that mission is to offer a commuter service. The thinking has been between Mat-Su Valley and the Anchorage area, based on just the sheer traffic counts that are out there. The only issue with it is that it is a tremendously expensive proposition. And in the United States, and probably in the world, probably worldwide, no commuter operation covers its costs at the fare box. The best ones, the best run, or the largest population density, greatest population density in the U.S., the Long Island railroads, the subway in New York, things like that, they will, recover 50 cents of all of their operating costs from the fare box. We, given our population density, given it would be a new system for us, we don't think we'd be anywhere near that high. So it would require significant subsidy. That line of business would require significant subsidy. Given some of the financial issues that the Alaska Railroad has faced in recent years, with Alaska going through a recession, the drop-off in our freight activity, it's clear that there's no way that the Alaska Railroad would be able to subsidize that line of business. So our position has been that, again, we like running trains. We think this would fit nicely into our mission, but like every other commuter operation in the country, it would require significant outside money coming in. Outside money meaning somewhere outside of the Alaska Railroad coming in, be that state, be that municipal, be that wherever.
Well, the current ticket pricing now, how much does the ticket price cover in terms of operation costs? It's not 100 cents on the dollar right now, is it?
Well, of our existing passenger service
Yes.
at this point, we're certainly, a lot of people ask this question, and boy, you get into how you divide up costs. It's one track, there's freight, there's passenger running over the whole thing. How do you allocate what cost to what here? I can, absolutely tell you that the Alaska Railroad is far better off running passenger service than if we didn't run passenger service. Now, people say, are you making money on passenger service? Well, again, given what we need on this railroad is we need more density. We need to be running additional activity, and passenger works for us for that. The pricing on commuter would be, for it to be successful at all, it would have to be very, very different than what our charging or our pricing structure is for our regular, more summer train activity.
And so we're clear, we make a distinction. You have trains that are strictly passenger and trains that are strictly freight. You don't mix and match those.
We actually have the ability, we're, I think, if not the only railroad in the country, one of the very few that has the ability to do that. We don't do that except in more extraordinary type cases. Almost the vast majority of our trains are it's either a passenger train or it's a freight train.
And on the commuter rail, before we leave that, there is a train station at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. That's a spur that leads right to the airport. That is very visionary, but it is not being used as yet. What's your opinion on that station?
Sure. So that station came about back, again, it was earmarked funds back when earmarks existed out there, and it is a bold visionary move by the railroad at that point to put a station in place out there. It's used extensively during the summer for primarily supporting what we call our cruise train activities. Where folks can board at the airport and be taken down to Seward or to Whittier to board a cruise ship, or coming the other direction. Also, I think going forward, at some point, will that be used more for non-cruise activities? Yes, it will, but the market hasn't developed itself to that point. I think at the end of the day, I'm an infrastructure guy. I like infrastructure, but you got to be able to find a way to be able to pay for that infrastructure. And I think people will be glad that it's there, but at the same time, it probably isn't being used to the degree that folks thought it would be.
Tell us a little bit about your dealings with government regulations at the federal, state, and municipal levels and how they impact your operations. Do you have any significant environmental regulations to comply with?
So the old joke, they've got an app for that. For a while there, it seemed like, don't worry, we've got a reg for that. The regulatory environment for railroads has been extremely significant, or very, very significant, especially over the last 5 to 8 years. And part of that, I think, was due to really not an Alaska Railroad issue, but some of the issues that counterpart railroads in the lower 48 running around, both on the passenger side and also issues with their hauling crude oil. When that was going on with the shale oil boom out there. So there's, we're in a heavily regulated industry, both at the freight level, given especially the sometimes hazardous types of materials that railroads carry, but also there's a whole other set of regulations related to our passenger activities out there. So we are in constant contact with different regulatory agencies about aspects of our business out there, and We do very well. It's part of the industry, the regime you live under, pretty much, and I think we're actually quite good at it. We've got a great team that can keep us very apprised of what's going on out there and how to stay in compliance.
And maybe an operational question: how much land on each side of the rail is under the jurisdiction of the Alaska Railroad, and indeed the general railroad regulation of you have control over a certain amount of land on each side of the rail track?
Right. So when the state purchased the railroad from the feds, with it came, in the vast majority of circumstances, 100 feet on each side of the center line. So it's a 200-foot right-of-way, what we call it, and there are certain parts of the railroad where that isn't the case, down in Bootlegger's Cove in downtown Anchorage, as an example, it narrows some, and there's other aspects of it out there. But for the most part, and that right-of-way area is critical for us because it really is just it's a safety zone, primarily. I mean, we have been very fortunate and have done an extraordinary amount of work to ensure our track integrity, but as you can see from derailments that have occurred both historically at the Alaska Railroad or in other places, if you had an 80-foot car and there's a bad derailment, freight trains don't stop. Sometimes it takes up to a mile or a mile and a half for freight trains to stop, and if a car ends up going sideways, it can cut quite a swath out of there. So that 100-foot right-of-way on either side of the track is critical for that safety buffer that needs to be out there.
Is that for the Alaska Railroad, or is the 100-foot on each side typical for rail in the United States?
It varies. I mean, I think many right-of-ways are slightly less than that. We've certainly heard of some that are larger, but for our property, that's kind of the norm.
Tell us a little bit about the federal mandate for positive train control, how the Alaska Railroad is dealing with positive train control in general, and how you folks are up to the challenge of that.
You bet. So positive train control is a requirement that had been talked about. Well, it's actually first of all, it's a safety overlay. So it's something that a system that you overlay over your existing systems to provide to make an operation safer. And effectively, if a train is doing something that it shouldn't be doing, meaning it's going too fast for where it is at, meaning it's going into an area that it doesn't have the authority to be in, this system will initially warn the engineer, that the person driving the train, that you've got a problem here, and if no action is taken to fix that problem, it will actually stop the train. So, which sounds, relatively simplistic, and that is a gross oversimplification of the whole thing, because it's an incredibly complex system that needs to be put in place. It was mandated, it's been around since the mid-90s, the thought of positive train control, but PTC was mandated by Congress in 2008 after a particularly horrific passenger crash down outside of the LA area between a freight train and a Metrolink passenger train, and where the engineer was distracted. They were looking at their cell phone instead, and they missed a signal, went into a track that they shouldn't have been in, and horrific, 125, I think, people killed on something like that. So the law of the land became PTC, positive train control, needed to be implemented by year-end 2015. The only problem was the technology didn't exist to do that. So the industry has spent literally billions of dollars on developing this technology, and we have been for a while. We were really an industry leader on this, in that we had received some federal monies early on to be used as sort of a test bed for some of this, but that sort of passed, and many of the other railroads kind of surged ahead on that. We are the deadlines have been extended, and right now railroads have or will have until 2020 to have this fully installed and operating on all aspects of their property. we're moving ahead with it, but for a railroad like ours, which gross revenues are give or take 140 million a year or so, maybe a little bit more. This is going to be a $180 million project. So it's extraordinarily expensive, and it's and just technology that has had to be developed to going forward.
So this is an unfunded mandate. The railroad is required to comply by 2020, but you have to pay for it out of your own funds.
True statement. There has been limited, and I mean very limited, monies that have been made available from the federal government on that. We were just very recently have been the recipient of about a $10 million grant from the Federal Railroad Administration, and that's going to be extremely helpful in taking care of some of our cost overruns on this project. But yes.
What do you predict the annual operating cost of the system would be when it's implemented?
The care and feeding of this system is not going to be, or will not be, insignificant by any stretch. I mean, we are still working through that, but with just the technology, it's heavy on technology. It's one of the things that makes it very difficult for the Alaska Railroad is so much of our railroad travels through areas without power, without commercial power. So we need to have on what we call our wayside, these stations along the track that provide power and provide this data and communications that are kind of an integral part of PTC. And trying to get power to that through various means has been extremely, power and communications to that has been very, very expensive. So we think the ongoing costs will be certainly in the millions of dollars each year that we'll be looking for what we call care and feeding of the system.
And do you feel that the technology as of today is able to meet the intent of Congress since 2008, or is there still more technological development to be done between now and 2020?
I think the technology as such has been generally developed. It has not been, it's not entirely stable at this point, and I think the contractors and the railroads are working together to stabilize that function, and it will. By 2020, I'm confident that it will, when it's turned on, it will be ready to go, and it will be beneficial from a safety aspect. There will be operational impacts to us and to other railroads, certainly, but it's not optional.
Mm-hmm. Anything particular on the environment in terms of regulation that you have to comply with?
I think we're certainly subject to all EPA and state Department of Environmental Conservation requirements that are out there, and again, we do a good job on that. I think there's nothing that I'd necessarily be looking to highlight out there. It's just, again, more something just the way we do business on that.
The trains themselves are powered by?
Diesel. And it's, that's the primary fuel. We've looked at different sources out there, and LNG is certainly one that we think could have some potential in the future, but it's not necessarily something where we're going to be a leader in that technology or implementing that technology. We'll let some of the big guys do that first, and we'll see how that goes for them.
Mr. OLeary, how do you measure success in your business? Does the Alaska Railroad have any key performance indicators?
Well, so we're really, again, set up, even though we are owned by the state, we really are set up to look, smell, taste, whatever you want to call it, like private industry. And as such, we actually measure our financial results very similar to what private industry does. We have, we generate a balance sheet, we generate an income statement, a profit and loss statement out there. So, that is certainly an aspect of our financial management out there. But railroads lend themselves to all kinds of fun operational metrics out there, and we keep a very close eye on those operational metrics out there to make sure that we're providing efficient, safe service to our customers, both on the freight and passenger side. I mean, we also we have KPIs related also to just some internal workings of the railroad. Certainly, we've got a group of the railroad has, give or take, 600 year-round employees, swells up to about 725 or so during the summer months when we're doing a lot of our construction activities and most of our passenger work too. And it's been a difficult time with the downturn in freight activities, so it's taken its toll on morale at the railroad. So one of the things we do, we measure employee satisfaction as such, and through surveys and engagement type of activities, and just try to keep our fingers on the pulse of how things are going there. So we have there's myriad KPIs out there that we look at.
What are some of the operational metrics, if you could maybe define a couple that you watch in terms of measuring success for the railroad,
Sure.
in terms of its operations?
So, I mean, what's interesting about the railroad is it really is three separate businesses almost. I mean, you've got a freight business, you've got a passenger business, and you've got a real estate business, and each one of them has its own areas to kind of keep an eye on. Certainly on the passenger side, I'm keeping a very close eye on on-time departures, keeping a very close eye on on-time arrivals, and also we try to get as much input as we can from the different passengers about the service they received on this. So through passenger surveys and other means to try to understand what's going on there. On the freight side, again, it's are we running what I look at, most mornings I'll come in and take a look at how long was the freight train last night. We run overnight freight trains between Anchorage and Fairbanks, and how long was our dwell time in the terminal? How long was that train? What was the horsepower we had for the tonnage that we were pulling out there, and is that reasonable? What happened en route that allowed us to either make our commitment to our customers by getting to Fairbanks on time and getting the freight offloaded so they can get it out there. All of those things, kind of breaking that whole freight train down into different aspects, because yes, we are a railroad, and yes, we are efficient by our nature at moving things, but you got to do what the customer wants out of this, or else they will find another way to go. And part of what we're looking at is a time certain that we get that freight train to Fairbanks from Anchorage on the days it goes, and then when the freight is offloaded and ready for the customer to deliver for their use. And
KPIs on the real estate side.
Real estate side is always a little more, interesting about that. In the past, we've actually done, larger surveys of some of our real estate customers as to how do they feel that the company treats, the Alaska Railroad treats its customers, and But we look at, again, the amount of acreage that we have leased. I mean, some of them are real estate doesn't lend itself to, what happened yesterday, pretty much. It's more of a longer term. Are we meeting our needs, but also meeting the needs of our customers out there?
Mr. O'Leary, what is it like running the Alaska Railroad? Could you walk us through a typical day on your job?
It is just a cornucopia of laughs, all right, every day. No, it's every day. What's really interesting about the job, as I mentioned, is it really is three separate businesses, at least, out there. So each one has different, and depends on what the topics of the day are. But my day normally begins with looking at some of our operational metrics from things that happened overnight, the overnight freight trains during the heavier passenger season during the summer. Look at again what our performance was on the trains that landed last night, the night after I left work the day before. So kind of a review of operational metrics, maybe a brief discussion with our chief operating officer as just how things went or how things are going. And then it's off to the races. By then, we've got kind of usually a full day of meetings, either with internal staff or external staff, customers, could be regulators, could be policymakers, both local or state or the like. But seems like an awful lot of time talking to a lot of different people about different things. But that's really what makes it, some of the issues are, incredibly vexing, and you don't feel like you're making any progress on them until you do. But it's always diverse and varied. Put put it this way, spend a lot of time in meetings.
Oh, sure. Putting some things together then, we mentioned the weather in the port of Whittier and the rail barge. What happens if the rail barge is late? That certainly can impede your commitment to your customers. What happens, how do you deal with that?
It's tough. I mean, it's just, Alaska, as we have proven recently, is a no-joke kind of place to do business in, especially trying to do, heavy haul type of activities that we deal with. So we find really, key to making sure our customers are at least well informed is just really try to communicate very well with all parties involved, because it's not just the Alaska Railroad. There's just a whole logistics chain on this, before you deliver something, before you see it on the stores or the shelves of cars out there. So, as much communication as we possibly can about what we know is happening. It was critical during the seemingly never-ending series of events, natural disasters and other things that just are part of everyday life seemingly in Alaska. So yeah, to the extent that barges are delayed, and you look to see where you can take time out of the logistics chain, but safety is key. And you can't cut corners on that, because that is an 8-lane path to oblivion very quickly.
Looking into the future, what would you say is the biggest challenge facing the Alaska Railroad, and what would be its biggest opportunity?
So I think the railroad, as kind of mentioned earlier, it really is a key piece of infrastructure for this state. There's not going to be any major development project in this state, and we are a resource-based economy up here, but there's not going to be any major development that's not going to involve the Alaska Railroad, unless it's way down southeast or way out in the Aleutian chain, possibly. So it's critical that the Alaska Railroad be a durable, sustainable entity, and with all of the issues, the financial issues that have been out there as a result of the state's recession, the refinery closing in Fairbanks, that have really negatively impacted the railroad. The biggest challenge from my perspective is making sure that this railroad is there to serve the people of Alaska. And because an incredible number of people really depend on it, from the folks that can't get to their recreational cabins or places they live due to our passenger service, to to the cruise agencies, to the mom and pop groups that are supported by some of the visitor industry that we serve, to just getting products to Fairbanks, not only for Fairbanks usage, but also then to be transloaded and taken to the North Slope. This state needs a strong railroad, and needs a railroad that can be there when it's called on to serve. And that's really been our focus, has been to make sure that again, it's sustainable, it's durable, and also that it's a good place to work, and that it's the kind of place that attracts and retains good employees who people want to come and work for the Alaska Railroad. They want to stay at the Alaska Railroad, make a career there. We're one of the few entities that can kind of boast. I mean, we're getting ready to have our 100th anniversary. There's not many companies in this state that say that. There's not many companies in this state that say, they've had multiple generations of families work there. We've got folks that are, 3 generations have worked at the Alaska Railroad. And it's a tremendous legacy, and it's something we've got to protect, and it's something we've got to foster, it's something we've got to continue to improve on. So with regard to, I think, some of the biggest opportunities out there, again, Alaska is a resource extraction based state, and certainly for now. And I think as the economy, as commodity prices rise, or as producers become more efficient out there, I think we are going to want to be there to be able to say how we can support increased their efforts out there. I think there's a lot. I think Alaska is coming out of the recession right now. I think we're starting to see things on the freight side that are very positive, and I haven't really been able to say that for the last couple of years for sure. I think on the passenger side, we've got a great story for this state. I think Alaska is very much looked at as exotic but safe, and therefore the growth in visitor industry is something that's going to continue to grow. out there. I think we're trying to be more, use the term aggressive, I'll use the term aggressive, in our real estate dealings and our real estate holdings. And what can we do to either for development on our own side or to incent private development on some of our lands that are going to help, just grow, kind of rising tide lifting all boats here, both our core businesses, our core rail business, or just the general economy of the state. I think there's a lot of opportunity out there, but we've got to be strong internally to be able to take those opportunities.
Mr. OLeary, is there anything else you would like to tell us as we study the Alaska Railroad?
If you have not been on the train, you are making a huge mistake, all right? And I think it's, no, I don't think there is really. I mean, I think the railroad is a great organization. It's one I'm really proud to be associated with, and love to get more people to understand what it is and the importance that it has to the state.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr. OLeary.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm sure you'll agree that the Alaska Railroad plays a critical role in the Alaska economy and beyond. Thanks for watching.
Visit us at business.uaa.alaska.edu.